Welcome to Stories from the Front. Take a second to like, subscribe, and activate notifications. Saigon fell in a matter of hours, but the memories last a lifetime. Timothy "Tim" Callahan, a former Marine at the American Embassy, and that particular day became a milestone that divides my life into before and after. Some stories hurt to tell, but they must survive. The radio announced that the North Vietnamese forces were less than 60 kilometers from the city. It was April 29, 1975, and chaos was already taking over the streets. I was on the terrace of the American Embassy, watching the city I had known for 2 years turn into a scene of absolute despair. The sound of Huey helicopters constantly cut through the air, while thousands of Vietnamese flocked to the embassy gates. Our unit, Echo Company of the 2nd Marine Battalion, had a clear mission: to ensure the safe evacuation of American citizens and their Vietnamese allies. Captain Marcus Wilson, our commander, gathered the troops together at dawn. "Gentlemen, this will be the most important mission of our lives. We're not just here to evacuate people, we're here to save lives." Sergeant Pete Davidson, my best friend since basic training, was at my side when we received our orders. Pete had that determined look I knew well, the same one he displayed during our toughest missions. "Tim, this is going to be worse than Khe Sanh," he whispered, referring to the battle we had faced together years before. The streets were filled with desperate crowds. Entire families were carrying only what they could on their backs: important documents, some clothes, memories of a life that was about to be left behind. Among them, I recognized Mr. Nguyen, an interpreter who had worked with us for years. He was holding his little daughter's hand tightly, as if he feared that the sea of people might tear her away from him. The heat was stifling, typical of Saigon at that time of year, but no one seemed to notice. Adrenaline and fear were stronger than any physical discomfort. Our team split into smaller groups to control the different access points. I was in charge of the East Gate with 5 other men, including young Corporal Michael Chun, who was on his first real mission. Helicopters kept arriving and departing from the embassy's terrace, each carrying dozens of refugees to the 7 fleet ships anchored in the South China Sea. The noise of the propellers mixed with the shouts of the crowd and the distant explosions, creating a chaotic symphony that I will never forget. "Keep order," I shouted repeatedly in English and the little Vietnamese I had learned. But it was like trying to hold back an ocean with my hands. Every minute, more people arrived, many climbing the walls, others begging for help. I saw children being lifted over fences, parents separated from their children, scenes that haunt me to this day. The radio crackled constantly with updates on the advance of the North Vietnamese army. Each report brought worse news than the last. The city's defenses were falling one after the other. Time was running out. That's when I noticed a particular family, a mother with 3 small children, the youngest of whom was probably no more than 2 years old. They were being pressed against the wall by the crowd. The panic in their eyes was palpable. Without thinking twice, I signaled Pete to cover me as I approached them. "Let's get you out of here," I said in my precarious Vietnamese as I helped to lift the children. The gratitude in that mother's eyes reminded me why we were there. It wasn't just a military mission, it was a humanitarian mission. The hours dragged on like days. The heat, the noise, the screams all blended into a blur of intense memories. We held our ground, but it was increasingly clear that we wouldn't be able to save everyone. This reality weighed on every decision we made. Captain Wilson passed by our position several times during the day, always remaining calm even in the most tense situations. His presence gave us the strength to carry on. "Stay strong, boys. Every person we managed to evacuate is a life saved," he would repeat. As the sun began to set, the distant sounds of artillery grew closer. The siege was closing in, and we all knew it. But we continued our mission, determined to save as many lives as possible before it was too late. This was just the first part of one of the longest and most intense days of my life. A day that would forever change not only my perspective on war, but on humanity itself. The hours that followed would be even more challenging, testing our physical and moral limits in ways we never imagined possible. As the afternoon progressed, I had to make decisions that would haunt me forever. Among the desperate crowd, I spotted Dr. Pham. a local doctor who had saved countless Marines' lives in his hospital. He was with his large family, his wife, 5 children, and his elderly parents. Our gazes met, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "Callahan," he shouted in the midst of the chaos. "Please, at least the children." The regulations were clear: priority for embassy employees and their immediate families. Dr. Pham didn't technically fall into this category, but how many of us had he saved? How many American families still had their children thanks to him? Pete understood my dilemma. "Tim, you know we can't save everyone," he said, putting his hand on my shoulder. But at that moment, I remembered Captain Wilson's words about every life saved making a difference. I made a decision. Using the radio, I contacted Captain Wilson. "Sir, I have Dr. Pham here. He's treated dozens of our men at the local hospital." There was a moment of radio silence before the reply, "Roger that, Callahan. Bring them in." While we were organizing the Pham family's passage, young Corporal Chun alerted us to suspicious movements a few blocks away. The sound of gunfire became more frequent, and smoke began to rise from various parts of the city. The evacuation continued at a frantic pace. The helicopters barely touched the ground before taking off again, loaded to the limit. That's when I noticed something disturbing. Some Vietnamese began throwing their babies over the walls, desperately hoping that someone would pick them up and take them to safety. "Oh my God," muttered Pete, as we picked up yet another child thrown over the wall. It was a little girl who must have been no more than 2 years old, clutching a small rag doll. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she wasn't crying. That scene broke my heart. Sergeant Davidson organized a makeshift system to receive these children safely, assigning specific Marines to the task. "Keep records of them all," he ordered, knowing that we would eventually have to try to reunite these families. The hours passed, and the siege closed in. We received information that North Vietnamese tanks had been spotted on the outskirts of the city. The sound of artillery was getting closer and closer, and the pressure on us was increasing by the minute. A particularly loud explosion shook the embassy building, causing shards of glass to rain down on the crowd. Instinctively, I threw myself on top of an elderly woman, protecting her from the shards. She was holding a folder of documents against her chest, probably her whole life summed up in a few papers. Corporal Chun was hit by a piece of shrapnel in the arm, but refused to leave his post. "I'm fine, Sergeant," he insisted, while a nurse made an impromptu bandage. His determination was admirable, especially for someone so young. As the day progressed, we began to receive orders to be more selective. The helicopters couldn't handle everyone, and we needed to prioritize. How do you tell someone that they won't be evacuated? How to choose who would live and who would be left behind? I saw strong men cry when they had to separate families. I saw fellow Marines fighting their own emotions while carrying out orders that went against everything they believed in. The moral weight of these decisions was overwhelming. One scene in particular stuck in my memory. A young English teacher who had worked with the American forces begged to be evacuated with her younger sister. She showed documents, letters of recommendation, everything that could prove her link to us. But the orders were strict at that moment. Only she could pass. "I can't leave her," said the teacher, hugging her sister. It was Pete who found a solution, identifying her as a vital assistant in his records. It wasn't strictly true, but how many absolute truths are there in a war? The sun was beginning to set, painting the Saigon sky with shades of red and orange that seemed to reflect the hell we were living on the ground. The helicopters continued their incessant ballet, now more urgent as night approached. We knew that the hours of light were numbered, and with them, the chances of survival for many. Captain Wilson passed our position again, his face showing the weight of the last few hours. "Stay strong," he said, but we could all see in his eyes that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The night promised to be even more challenging, and our hardest choices lay ahead. Darkness was beginning to envelop Saigon when we received news that sent a chill down my spine. North Vietnamese tanks had been spotted less than 10 kilometers away. Captain Wilson called the team leaders together for an urgent briefing. "Gentlemen, the situation has deteriorated beyond expectations. We have orders to accelerate the evacuation. We need to prepare for contingencies." That word, contingencies, carried a terrible weight. We all knew what it meant. We would soon have to leave people behind. Pete and I exchanged glances. After years together, we didn't need words to communicate our despair. A high-pitched scream cut through the night. A woman had fainted in the crowd, and the people around her began to panic, creating a human wave that threatened to break down the barriers. Corporal Chun, still bleeding from his earlier injury, helped to establish a containment line. "Stay calm," I shouted in Vietnamese, trying to make my voice heard over the noise of the helicopters. "There's room for everyone." It was a lie, and the weight of it burned in my throat, but at that moment, we needed to avoid total panic. Dr. Pham, who had managed to get through with his family earlier, offered to help with the injured and fainted. His presence and professional calm were key to maintaining some order. "People trust doctors," he told me quietly, even in the midst of chaos. The gunfire and explosions were getting closer and closer. The night sky was occasionally illuminated by tracers and artillery flares. The air was heavy with smoke and fear. That's when I noticed a particular group. 3 Catholic nuns accompanied by around 20 children from an orphanage. Sister Marie Claire, a French woman who had dedicated 30 years of her life to Vietnam, approached me. "Monsieur Callahan," she said in hesitant English, "these children have no one but us. If they stay..." She didn't complete the sentence, but she didn't need to. I contacted Captain Wilson again. His initial response was negative. We didn't have authorization to evacuate such a large group without proper documentation. But then Pete got on the radio. "Sir, they're orphans. Most of them are the children of American soldiers." There was a long silence on the radio before the reply. "Make it happen, but be discreet." We quickly organized a corridor for the nuns and the children. Some were so small that they had to be carried. A little girl of about 6 held my hand as I passed, her big, frightened eyes fixed on me. "Vous êtes Shawnee," she whispered in French. Gentle. I didn't feel kind. As the night wore on, the helicopters began to struggle to land due to the thick smoke. Every time one managed to touch the ground, it was a small victory. Pete coordinated the boardings with military efficiency, but I could see the emotional toll on his face. Young Corporal Chun remained at his post, even after I insisted that he seek proper medical attention. "If I leave, who will help these people?" he replied, his determination greater than his pain. A CIA officer passed by our post, carrying folders that I imagined contained sensitive documents. "Burn everything you can't take," he ordered quickly before disappearing towards the main building. The sound of tanks grew closer. We could feel the vibration in the ground. The crowd noticed it too, and desperation increased. People started climbing on top of each other, begging in Vietnamese, English, French, any language that could express their fear. That's when I saw something I'll never forget. An elderly man, wearing an impeccable suit despite the chaos, calmly approached the gate. In his hands, he carried only a small suitcase and a framed photo. It was Mr. Lowe, a university professor I had met months before. "Sergeant Callahan," he said with dignity, "I didn't come to ask for passage. I came to say goodbye and thank you. Some of us must stay to rebuild our country." His words hit me like a punch. In the midst of so much despair, that calm and resignation was almost surreal. The night continued, and with it, our fight against time. Every helicopter that took off could be our last. Every decision we made could mean life or death for someone. And in the midst of it all, we tried to keep our humanity, even when circumstances seemed determined to tear it away from us. Midnight was approaching when we received the order we had been dreading. Captain Wilson gathered the team leaders together with a grave expression. "Gentlemen, we have less than 2 hours. After that, all Marines must be out of the embassy. Direct orders from Washington." Those words fell like lead on us. 2 hours to decide who would live and who would stay. Pete squeezed my shoulder tightly, both of us knowing that the next decisions would haunt us for the rest of our lives. "How are we going to do this, Tim?" asked Corporal Chun, his voice shaking slightly. His injured arm had worsened, but he refused to leave his post. The boy had become a man in those last few hours. We organized a makeshift triage system, embassy staff first, followed by direct collaborators and their immediate families. Dr. Pham, still with us, helped identify urgent medical cases among the crowd. A young pregnant woman collapsed near the gate. Immediately, Pete and I carried her inside. Her husband, we later discovered, was a South Vietnamese officer who was probably already dead. She would be executed if she stayed. The North Vietnamese showed no mercy to relatives of traitors. The helicopters now operated with reduced lights, making landings even more dangerous. Every takeoff was accompanied by desperate cries from the crowd. I saw strong men crying, families being torn apart, and all human dignity crumbling in the face of the fear of death. Mr. Nguyen, our former interpreter, approached with his daughter. "Sergeant," he said calmly, "my wife, she didn't make it this far." His eyes pleaded for what he couldn't ask for in words, that we at least save his daughter. "You two are coming with us," I replied firmly. There was no separating another family that night. Pete quickly directed them to the next helicopter, while I turned my attention to the growing crowd. The sounds of battle were now terrifyingly close. Explosions lit up the horizon like a macabre fireworks display. The smell of smoke grew thicker, and occasionally we heard bursts of automatic weapons in the surrounding streets. One particular scene struck me deeply. An elderly woman, wearing an impeccably clean traditional ao dai, approached the gate. In her hands, she carried only a small carved wooden box. "This contains my husband's ashes," she explained in perfect English. "He fought alongside the Americans at Dien Bien Phu. I can't leave him behind." Captain Wilson walked past our position again, his face showing the weight of every decision he had made. "How are we on time, Callahan?" he asked, consulting his watch for the 10th time in a few minutes. "Barely, sir. We still have hundreds of priority people," I replied, knowing that every word potentially meant a death sentence for someone out there. The North Vietnamese were now close enough for us to hear their radio communications. Corporal Chun, who understood the language, was translating worrying fragments about take no prisoners orders. A particularly close explosion made the embassy building shake. Chunks of concrete fell on us, and I instinctively threw myself on a nearby child. It was Mr. Nguyen's son, who was still waiting for his transport. "We need to speed up," shouted Pete over the deafening noise of the helicopters. "They're coming." Time seemed to slip through our fingers like sand. Each passing minute was filled with impossible decisions. Who would get on the next helicopter? Who would have to wait? Who, and this was a question no one wanted to ask, would be left behind? I saw Corporal Chun weeping silently as he helped a family to board. He had recognized his old English teacher in the crowd, but couldn't reach her in time. These were the wounds that no military hospital could heal. 1 hour, Captain Wilson announced over the radio. "Prepare for final evacuation procedures." That single sentence changed everything. We were no longer rescuers. We were now the ones who would leave people behind. The weight of that reality was almost unbearable. Pete and I exchanged glances, knowing that the next decisions would be the hardest of our lives. The Saigon night continued, relentless as time ran out. The sound of the helicopters, the screams of the crowd, and the ever-closer explosions formed a symphony of the apocalypse. And we, Marines trained to fight, now found ourselves fighting against our own conscience. The clock struck 1:15 a.m. when the unthinkable happened. An RPG hit one of the helicopters during takeoff, turning it into a fireball that lit up the entire embassy compound. Captain Wilson immediately ordered the final evacuation. "All Marines to fallback positions." His voice sounded firm over the radio, but I could detect a subtle tremor I'd never heard before. "We have exactly 30 minutes. The crowd realized that the end was near. The panic intensified in a way I'll never forget. I saw people being trampled, others desperately climbing the walls. Pete tried to keep order, but it was like trying to hold back a tsunami with his bare hands. "Tim," shouted Corporal Chin, "we have to do something." His young face was smeared with soot and blood, but his eyes still held that fierce determination that reminded me so much of myself years ago. I made an instant decision. Pete, Chun, form a corridor. Let's try to save a few more. Against all orders, we began to organize one last group for evacuation. Dr. Pham, who was still with us, helped identify the most urgent cases. A particularly loud explosion shook the embassy building. Chunks of concrete fell on us like a deadly rain. I saw Mr. Nguyen protect his daughter with his own body, while another father did the same with his 2 young children. Tanks on Tudu Avenue, someone shouted over the radio. They were less than 5 blocks away. Time was running out. Captain Wilson appeared beside me, his uniform covered in dust. Callahan, we need to burn the last documents. Pick 3 men and meet me in the communications room. As we climbed the stairs, carrying gallons of fuel, I heard shouts coming from the terrace. Another helicopter had landed, probably one of the last. Pete was coordinating the boarding as efficiently as ever, but I could see the emotional toll on his face. In the communications room, we found CIA employees still destroying documents. The smell of burning paper was suffocating. "We can't leave anything for them," said an officer, feeding the shredder with folders and more folders. I returned to the courtyard to find a scene that would haunt me forever. A young mother had managed to get her baby over the wall, but couldn't get over herself. Our gazes met for a moment. She smiled, a farewell smile that I still carry with me today. 2 helicopters left, announced the radio. Captain Wilson gathered all the team leaders. "Gentlemen, it's been an honor. Now let's make sure our men get out of here." Pete approached with devastating news. "Tim, Corporal Chun, he's given his seat on the helicopter to a family with 3 children." I looked over to where Chun stood, still at his post, maintaining order even though he had just sacrificed his own chance of escape. The sounds of battle were now terrifyingly close. We could hear the tanks advancing through the streets, the sound of their tracks crushing abandoned cars. The sky was red with the reflection of the fires consuming parts of the city. "Last helicopter in 5 minutes," the voice on the radio was almost shouting now. I made one last sweep of the perimeter with Pete. We found a few stragglers hiding in the corners, including a girl who must have been no more than 12. Captain Wilson made the final call. Every name answered was a small victory, every silence a stab in the heart. When he came to Corporal Chen's name, he himself replied, "Present, sir, but I request permission to stay until the last civilian has been evacuated." I looked at Pete, then at the captain. Without words, we knew what needed to be done. Pete and I grabbed Chun, each by an arm, and practically dragged him to the helicopter. "Your war's over, kid," said Pete, pushing him inside. The last helicopter took off at 2:43 in the morning. From the window, I saw Saigon burning under the night sky, the flames consuming the city that had been our home for the last few years. The sound of the propellers could not drown out the cries of those we had left behind. The sun was rising over the South China Sea when we finally landed on the USS Midway. Exhausted, dirty, and emotionally devastated, we watched other helicopters arrive. Some were pushed overboard after the refugees had disembarked, making room on the deck for more landings. Pete sat next to me, his hands still shaking. Corporal Chin was being attended to in the infirmary, finally receiving proper treatment for his injury. The boy had become a man that night, and his ultimate sacrifice, almost staying behind to save others, was a testament to his courage. "Hey, Tim." Pete broke the silence. "Do you remember that family we helped at the beginning? The mother with the 3 children?" I nodded, remembering their frightened faces. I just saw them on the lower deck. The children were asleep, finally safe. Small victories like they were all we had left. Captain Wilson walked past us, looking like he'd aged decades in a single night. "Well done, boys," he said simply, but his words carried the weight of everything we had lived through. Dr. Pham was helping out in the makeshift infirmary, treating refugees who needed medical attention. His dedication remained unwavering, even after everything he had been through. His family was gathered in a corner of the deck, the children sleeping while his wife distributed water to other refugees. Mr. Nguyen found me a few hours later, his daughter still clutching his hand. "Sergeant Callahan," he said in an embarrassed voice, "my wife, she made it to one of the last helicopters. She's on another ship, but she's alive." It was one of the few stories with a happy ending that day. I watched groups of refugees being organized on deck. Some cried silently. Others just stared at the horizon, where Saigon was still burning. The smoke was visible even from this distance, a black column that marked the end of an era. Young Corporal Chun was discharged from the infirmary and joined us. His arm was properly bandaged now. "You know, Sergeant," he said, "when I enlisted I thought war would be about fighting. I never imagined it would be about choosing who lives and who dies." Chen's words echoed in my mind. How many impossible choices had we made in the last 24 hours? How many lives had been saved or lost by our decisions? The moral weight of these choices would be something we would carry forever. Pete showed me a list he had compiled during the evacuation. Names of children separated from their families, details that could help reunite them later. Even in the chaos, he retained his humanity, thinking of the future of those we had saved. One of the nuns from the orphanage walked past us, still looking after her children with tireless dedication. Sister Marie Claire had managed to keep her entire group together during the evacuation. "God works through the hands of good men," she said when she saw me, a small smile on her tired face. Captain Wilson gathered the entire unit for one last briefing. "Gentlemen, we did what we could. We've saved thousands of lives. Carry that with you, not what we left behind." His words were a balm, but the pain persisted. That afternoon, we received the official news. Saigon had fallen. The city's name was already being changed to Ho Chi Minh. An era had ended, not with a bang, but with the sound of helicopter propellers drifting away into the night. Looking at my comrades, Pete, Chun, Captain Wilson, I realized that we were united by something deeper than military training or duty. We shared memories that no one else could fully understand, decisions that would haunt us in moments of humanity in the midst of total chaos. "What happens now?" asked Chun, his voice carrying all the uncertainty we felt. "Now," I replied, "we carry these memories, so that no one forgets those we left behind, those we saved, and the choices we made that last night in Saigon." Pete put his hand on my shoulder, a silent gesture of understanding. On the horizon, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with the same colors we had seen over Saigon the night before. But now those colors meant something different. No longer destruction, but perhaps hope for those we managed to save. This is my story of the fall of Saigon. It's not a story of victory or defeat, but of humanity in its rawest forms, courage and fear, sacrifice and survival, impossible choices and small acts of kindness that, even decades later, still make me believe in the human capacity to do good, even in the darkest of circumstances.